Okay, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to this special seminar that we are so excited about. Kay Lund is really an accomplished scientist, and she's had an academic career that's included appointments at Massachusetts General Hospital and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Most notably, she has worked in the area of gastroenterology, but it's been quite eclectic: stem cells, the microbiome, and tumor-promoting signals. And she told me, I was just meeting her for a few minutes, that she had an R01 within 1 year of finishing her postdoc. So I don't know if the rest of you are impressed. I was totally impressed. Anyway, Kay's publications have really spanned not only gastroenterology and neurology, but more recently, a focus on workforce diversity, women, and physician scientists. And there's no doubt that she is a creative force, even with her publications. And two of, I think, my favorite titles are, my favorite, very favorite, is Clinical Investigator Training and the Need to Pilot New Approaches to Recruiting and Retaining This Workforce. And it's closely followed by Women's Careers in Biomedical Science, Implications for the Economy, Scientific Discovery, and Women's Health. She is currently the director of a new division. It's of workforce development in the Division of Extramural Sciences at the National Institutes of Health. And she's going to talk to us this afternoon, as you see, on navigating the to advance your career, no small sort of item, and tips for successful grant writing. So Dr. Lund, thank you so much.
Are you good with everything? Yes, I think so, as long as this is on. Okay, so can everybody hear this? It's turned on? Okay, great. So I'm going to just give a short, fun introduction to my career path, challenges, rewards, and lessons learned. And then I'll introduce the division and then give overviews about different programs for research training, career development, and then how to evaluate those specific programs. Some trends in the workforce, including the physician scientist workforce, and then I'll end with some guidance on preparing successful grant applications, as well as some new issues in terms of early stage investigators and a requirement for Orchid IDs. So what happened with me, I grew up in a very depressed coal mining town in Lancashire, England. I was the first generation to go to college, and this was after skipping a year at grammar school. I went to Newcastle and got a first class honours bachelor's degree when I was 20, and then went on to do my PhD and got my PhD when I was 23. The PhD was great because I actually did basic and clinical research on gastrin. I tried to develop a radioimmunoassay as a treatment or a diagnostic treatment for gastric ulcers. It turned out that wasn't the case, but it was a diagnostic treatment or a diagnostic thing for Zollinger-Ellison tumors. This gave me daily interaction with great. I did a lot of teaching of medical students as well as science students, and I had a really dedicated mentor who said, if you get a good result, do everything you can to prove it wrong, and if it pans out, you're onto something. So that was helpful. I then got an offer as a postdoc at Mass General and Harvard, and I got multiple offers for different fellowships. I took a British Science Research Council fellowship, and I went to a Howard Hughes molecular investigator lab. And this was right at the start of the recombinant DNA revolution. And because I'd only done physiology at that point, I embarrassed myself in the first lab meeting. Where is that DNA library located in Boston? Thinking there was a building with a lot of books of DNA sequences. And that really taught me I needed to learn biochemistry and molecular biology fast, which I did. Unfortunately, the project that I had actually clone the gastrin gene was done by a different lab just a couple of weeks after I arrived. And so I went on to a new project, which actually led to cloning discovery of glucagon-like peptide 1 and 2, which are now pretty high-level drugs. This is my husband, then Mark. This is us getting married in the Ecodome. I left England in September, came over in November, and then we went to immigration and said, can we extend his visitor visa so that he can stay? And they said, no, but if you get married, he can stay on a J2 visa. So we got married, and it's been a good marriage ever since. So then I was offered to stay at Mass General and Harvard. I was also offered a job at McGill, but I was offered this job at UNC Chapel Hill. And even though I was offered many jobs during that period of time, Chapel Hill, and the research that I did was glucagon-like peptides, IGF, brain, diabetes, Crohn's, cancer, microbiome. The most important part of this was that I had a science family, many students, postdocs, and early stage faculty I trained. This actually shows you some of my daughter, Emma and Jeff, and their new grandson, and my daughter, Alice, and her husband, Jeremiah. These three are all MDs. They now have 2 children as well. And then this is my husband, who really took a major role in actually looking after the kids while I was a scientist. Judd Van Wyk was really one of my favorite mentors of all. His advice to me was, if you're appointed to a committee, don't show up, so they won't ask you to be on a committee again. And then Don Powell, who was then the chair of gastroenterology, I took my first grant that I wrote, and I wrote the whole thing, and he said to me, Kay, what are you trying to say? So I told him, and he said, you know, you speak a lot better than you write. Could you go and write that down? So the career at UNC was actually very rewarding. I enjoyed it. I had multiple job offers to be chairman. I couldn't take them. And then I got offered this job at NIH. And so now here I am, and I do enjoy it. So I'm the director of the Division of Biomedical Research Workforce, which was really set up because of the biomedical research workforce and the physician scientist workforce reports that came out around 2014. The goal of this division is to develop, maintain, enhance, and assess NIH policies and programs for research training, career development, and diversity of the biomedical research workforce. And then the other side is to do evaluations so that we can actually take a look at different programs. And I'll talk about some of the evaluations to ask what is their impact. Are they really allowing or promoting people to transition to the next stage? We've recently been given oversight of early stage investigator extension policies and a committee that actually looks at the application of those. That's actually been interesting as well. And then the Repayment, which used to be a separate division, is now within DBRW, in part because loan repayment is part of trying to maintain the research workforce. And I really have a talented staff who've been very helpful. So just a few things that you can look at. This is the NIH Research Training website. This is something that you can access. And then they have these different kiosks across the entire career span. And this is up to date. So you can go into any of these kiosks and actually find out what are the current programs that are available at NIH. And then these are the funding options across the career path. So the training grants, the fellowships, career development or K awards, they weren't named for me, and then these research grants. And I'll focus a little bit also later on the loan repayment programs to give people an update on where they stand right now. I'll also talk about the diversity supplements, because there's a group that's actually working together to try and enhance, update the diversity supplements, particularly at the postdoc and early career investigator stage. But these are really the programs that could help people transition to the next program they may want to go to. So first, some updates about the pre and postdoc National Research Service Awards, or NRSAs as they're called. And these are the training grants, the T awards, and the fellowships. We have a pretty big data set right now on the outcomes of T32 postdoctoral appointees between 95 and 2012. It's not yet public, but we're actually going to put together a public report on this. The reason we did this is because of this loss of particularly women and those from underrepresented groups in the career investigator stage. What is interesting about this particular data set, though, is a pretty small percentage of the people who are appointed to the T32s actually go on to get independent funding. This is like 10 to 15%. Those who do apply actually have pretty high funding rates. And so one thing that's under discussion at NIH right now is ways to actually really improve, enhance the career development aspects of these training grant awards. The other one is a paper that you can look at. I had quite a bit to do with this, although I'm not an author on this. This was very soon after I arrived at NIH, which looks at postdoc F32 fellowships. And actually, it's not just saying how many people go on to get the next stage award. It's actually really comparing those that got funding and those that missed funding, and saying what impact did this have. And it really had a significant effect on individuals going on to the next stage. And yet one concern at NIH is that the numbers of these postdoc fellowships being awarded has actually declined, and we're working to try and change that. The other one that's important for everybody to know here, if they have an NRSA, is that even at the graduate stage, but at the postdoc stage as well, fellows and trainees can actually spend an additional 25% of their time, and that can be 10 hours a week, or it could be a period of time of a month during the fellowship, in part-time research, doing something different than what they were appointed for, teaching or clinical employment. And for some reason, many of the institutions are not actually following that, and this is allowable, and it can, as long as it's something that's different and is going to extend on the career development for the NRSA appointee or fellow, this is a some people will say, oh, if we do this for a graduate student, then it's just going to increase their time to degree. Actually, the data that we have shown that those that actually go out and do something else, even when they're in graduate school, they can bring something back to the lab and help. So I'll give an example. We had someone who went out to do a journalism externship. And she came back to my lab and actually really helped everybody to write better, communicate more clearly. And it didn't do anything to increase the time to her getting her PhD. So it really is important to allow individuals to do something that will advance their career development. So then what are the current ongoing recommendations? We've actually been able to implement stipend increases and increase funds, particularly for postdoctoral fellowships, but we've had stipend increases for all levels between 2016 and 2020. We have, budget permitting, the go-ahead to continue stipend and benefit increases. There's been quite a bit of discussion. Currently, postdocs are only allowed to be on an RSA for 3 years. I get a lot of input from the AAMC and from clinicians saying that's not enough time to allow them to get the training and the publications they need to go on to independence. It would take a while for us to be able to do this, but we're certainly thinking about it. But this uniform implementation of the additional 25% effort, I think, is really important to know that people can do it, because it will enhance the stipends that individuals get. So it's maybe more equitable in terms of what people should be getting. And then promoting career development as part of the NRSA itself is important. It can be something in laboratories, at other institutions, and even going out to do policy and communication. Just a few updates. The National Institute of General Medical Sciences has recently issued their own funding announcements with enhanced rigor and reproducibility, and also enhanced attention to wanting training in data science, because there's a recognition that we're really in a data science world these days, and people really need to know how to do data science. We've got the absolute go-ahead that there will be enhanced rigor and reproducibility training in all training grants, a requirement for this from all institutes and centers effective May 2020. We're in the process of trying to talk about data, biostatistics, data science, computational science, bioinformatics in all training programs. This is still under discussion because we've had some input to say that all of the data science that is being discussed is not relevant to every particular training grant. So stay tuned, and I'll keep people updated on that. So these are the research supplements to promote diversity. This is the funding announcement that people can go to. This supplement to an existing grant, which can go all the way from high school to early career investigator. NIGMSO is the only institute that only funds diversity supplements up to the postdoc. All the other institutes and centers fund investigators. The goal is to really enhance diversity of the workforce, to give people the opportunity and training that they need to be able to go on to apply for their next grant. These are administratively reviewed by the institute and center that's funding the original grant, and many grants are eligible for these diversity supplements. You can go take a look at this link here. Currently, NIH institutes and centers have different deadlines and policies. Some of them have rolling deadlines every couple of months. Some of them have only 2. We're really trying to see if we could harmonize that better. Discussions in progress are really enhancing the mentoring components as well as harmonizing those deadlines and policies. So stay tuned, but these are worth applying for. Certainly I had a number of people across the entire career spectrum who got these diversity supplements, and pretty much all of them are still actually doing research or a science-related career. This just shows you a breakdown of some of the data, investigator, postdoc, predoc. The predoc is certainly the largest number, but this is the area where we're really losing some diversity, postdoc to investigator transition. So we're really trying to work on that to enhance these awards. So what I want to do now is switch to the Postdoctoral Mentored Career Development Awards, or the K Awards. I'm going to focus on the K01, K08, K23. I'll give you a summary of some outcomes analysis on the KL2 Awards, which are to the CTSAs, and the K99R00 as well. And then I'll talk a little bit about what are the positives of some of these different awards and what are some of the concerns that have been raised. So the KL2 seems like it's really had some success. There was this paper that people can take a look at. It was the information about more than 900 scholars. 68% of them had a medical degree. 96% engaged in research after the KL2 career development experience. And then of the scholars completing this, 39% received independent funding with slightly greater, this is the interesting part, percentage of funding from non-NIH sources. And this may be that it was too early for them to apply for an R01. Non-clinicians had a greater than 2-fold more probability of independent funding, but females and those from underrepresented groups were equally likely. As future analysis, we should ensure the ability to capture the sources of non-NIH funding, and there are some, I'll talk about the Orchid IDs later, because that will help. We really want to define drivers of greater non-NIH funding. Is it the career stage? Is it that it's less competitive? And then really, how do we better promote future NIH funding and this balance between research and clinical duties? I've talked with several people today about this. It's difficult for clinicians to put in the amount required for many of the awards right now. But let's talk about some of the K awards. So the K99R00 is one that has 2 phases. One is a K99, which is a postdoc. It's mentored, it must be affiliated with an institution, and individuals must be within 4 years of attaining their Ph.D. or completing their clinical training. Of the awardees that were in 2007, which is when these first started, a very large number transitioned to the R00, and even in 2014, awardees, they've already transitioned to the R00. The R00, independent tenure track or equivalent appointment, their own lab, limited teaching and clinical responsibilities, which can be tough for clinicians. And then the quality of the tenure track offer is administratively reviewed by the NIH staff at each IC. This is the parent award, which is pretty much from all IC. There is a brand new one, which is the Brain Initiative Award. This is it's 10 different NIH institutes and centers, and this has got to be in a neurotechnological area for people to apply. This actually allows 5 years to get to the K99, and women are eligible to apply for this award, diversity one. NIAID is a physician scientist one. This is the only one right now for physician scientists of the K99 variety. And this requires only 50% effort, with the recognition that for physicians, the 75% is not that easy. Available data certainly indicate high transition from R00 to R01 at an earlier than average stage. And I'll talk about some of the positives of that and maybe some of the concerns I have. Then before I do that though, how do you evaluate programs? So you can just do simple metrics, which is the number of applicants and awardees, number who continue in research in specific programs, the demographics. This is an interesting paper that's worth looking at. This was using representation ratio, which is the NIH funded percentage of individuals in certain gender, racial, and ethnic groups versus the relevant labor market. But then you've also got to do the evaluation of program impact. And what that does is, as I mentioned before, compares applicants with similar scores, characteristics, who were funded, and those that received an excellent score but just missed funding. And this is more to directly assess what does this award itself do. And what we did in this study was look at the percentage of those who go on to the next award or independence and R01 equivalent. And we also looked at it in periods of different NIH budget allocations during the NIH doubling and also post-doubling up to 2016. So what was the impact of these K awards? So interestingly, the K01, which is largely for PhDs during the doubling, had no significant effect. And this may very well be because during that time, PhDs just went on and applied for an R01. Doubling though, this has had really a major effect on the success of individuals going on to get an R01. The K08, during the doubling, it had a significant effect. Post-doubling, no significant effect. And that may be, again, a concern that clinicians can earn more than they can where they're getting percent effort paid on research grants. K23, which is for clinician patient-oriented research, had a significant effect during the doubling and post-doubling. So this is important to note that are having an effect for the K01 in particular, because funding's got pretty competitive in recent years. This has been important for keeping PhDs in business. So what are the pros and cons of these different awards? All of the awards are mentored training with a goal to promote successful independent careers. Post-doubling, as mentioned, K23, greater than K01, greater than K08. And also, we haven't published this yet, but we will, for women and underrepresented groups. The R00 certainly promotes earlier independence and success in independent R01, but we can't really compare the R00 because it's funded by different institutes and centers. It's not scored. What are the cons? There's a small delay in the time to first R01 independence for K01, K23, K08. This is the one that's a concern for me. I had one of my former postdocs who actually went and interviewed 3 times at a pretty prestigious institution. She had a K01, she had some different awards from different professional societies. She was told she absolutely had a position at this great institution, and then she got an email at midnight saying, no, we're not hiring you. And they hired somebody with an R00. And this is, in some departments at some institutions, only those with an R00 or a K99 are actually getting interviewed. And that's not the best way to use these awards. The other one is varied levels of salary and research support across NIH institutes and centers, which varies from the salary cap for clinicians to much less than that, and the feasibility of 75% effort for clinicians. So one of the things, we have this working group that is working and discussing strategies to enhance these awards. We're also gathering relevant data to actually look at what are the outcomes of those K awards that pay to the salary cap and those K awards that permit 50% effort instead of 75% effort, so that that's actually an evidence base for changes. This just shows you some demographics of R01 applicants and awardees. Well, not demographics, it's applicants and awardees by degree. Maybe a concern is that the PhDs are a much larger number of the R01 funded pool. The MDs are the next, and then the MD PhDs. If we look at funding rates, though, which is shown here, the funding rates are higher, at least in the last few years, for MD PhDs than for MDs and PhDs. Again, we're trying to look at this and think about ways that we can better harmonize the outcomes in these independent awards. And then this just shows you some trends in funding for MDs, MD PhDs, and PhDs. We only got this to 2015. We're going to be increasing this. But the most important thing is that this red line is for early career investigators who are less than 40 or less than or equal to 40. This green line is for those that are 41 to 50. And then we have the older ones, mid, early, late, 51 to 60 in blue. The early to late is 61 to 70, and then the late is 70. And so the concern is that these early career investigators, there has been a major decline for those with clinical degrees, and there's still been a decline for PhDs, but a less major decline. And so again, this is a concern that MDs are just not going on to actually apply for this independent funding because they can earn more than the salary cap if they're doing clinical work. So basically, we're working on a NIH policy to enhance funding of early stage investigators across the entire NIH institutes and centers. We've actually hit the levels in the past few years to fund more early stage investigators. And hopefully this will help to reverse some of these trends. Actually focus more on MDs and MD PhDs, and that's something that is certainly under discussion. So then this, and I'm not going to go through all of these, you can take a look at the slides. These are the recommendations that came out of the Physician Scientist Working Group report, and we've definitely been involved in implementing many of them. But one of the ones that came out was support pilot programs to improve and shorten physician scientist training, their ability to get training in research and actually go into useful and productive research careers. And there were 3 2016 workshops that I actually organized. And what we did was we brought people from the outside to talk at these workshops and also at different levels, K awardees, F32 awardees. And then we actually talked with some of the ABMS, the individuals that are involved in approving different clinical projects. And then we took it to all of the NIH directors, and they actually approved this pilot program that I'll talk about now. So this is a research in residency program. It's called an R38. The next deadline, if anybody's interested in this, is February 13th, 2020. It's supported by just 4 institutes and centers, with NHLBI funding the most. NCI funds only 1 of these. NIID is funding 3 to 4. And the National Institutes of Aging has just decided to participate. And then what this is followed by is anybody who is actually in this particular program can apply for what is a limited competition K38. It's not as much required as in those individual K awards. These application due dates are due pretty soon, November 18th, 2019, and then in 2020 and 2021. The other important point is we know that residents will often transition to another institution for their fellowship, and if they want to do that, they can actually still apply for this K38 award. And as I mentioned, it's a limited competition only for those completing the R38. But this is worth taking a look at. There's actually been 4 times more applications for these R38 awards than there have been awards, and we'll certainly be following the transitions of these appointees to a K38. This is the research in residency components. There's a program director. Pretty much all of the funded programs had more than one residency program, such as internal medicine and pediatrics. The residency director was involved so that they knew this was going on. They have funds to allow short boot camps and workshops to try and get a skill. So if they wanted to say, go do a bioinformatics course, there is money for them to be able to sign up for those. There's 80% time for 1 year, and that means over the entire residency. So if it's a 3 or 4 year residency, only 80% time for 12 months of that residency is required. It can span multiple years of residency, and the most typical have been 6 months in years 2 and 3, or 4 months in years 2, 3, and 4. As I mentioned, there's research and career development, mentor development programs, and then there will be an NIH workshop which will bring the PIs and some of the appointees to NIH to just talk about how these programs worked, what was it helpful. And then this is just a summary of the first applications and awards. We'll hear about the second application. These were the institutions from NHLBI who got these awards, these from NIID and then one from NCI. But the common features, as mentioned, were multiple departments in research, internal medicine, family medicine, pathology, cross-discipline interactions, strong mentoring components with multiple mentors, and then mentoring with goals to promote continued research. So definitely take a look at this, because this is worth looking at. So then I just want to transition now to some tips on how to go about transitioning to the next stage into research independence. So what I'm focusing on here are transitions from a career development award to an independent research grant. All of the 24 institutes and centers have different priorities, and so it's really important to know that the proposed project, if you're going in for one for a K award or an R1, fits the IC mission. This is always a fun one. Contact the current program officer if you have an F or a K, or again, you're going for a K to an R. You can't just give them a call. You need to send them an email with the question, short email with the question in the subject heading, and then set up a phone call to talk to them. So what do you think about when you're transitioning from this K to R, or even from an F to a K? Most important thing is the mentor. The mentor has to be absolutely supportive about a transition to an independent project at the time of the K application and during the award, an agreed upon timeline. The other one is discussing and revisiting credit and authorship on publications. If a K awardee is going only as the first author on a paper, and the mentor is the last author on the paper, that's still suggesting that the mentor is the leader on that study. And so for most of my studies, I've talked to them and said, if you really did this whole project, you wrote the paper, you're deserving of being the senior author on the paper, and I don't even need to be on the paper. And that went down well, actually, particularly with the PhDs. With the MDs, they often still wanted me to be at least an author, if not a senior author. But it is really important, because that shows that that K awardee is really on the way to transitioning to independence. The other one is don't lose early stage investigator status before going for the R1. A lot of people will wait until year 4 or year 5 of a K award before they apply for an R1. Much better to do it in year 2 and 3. You may not get that first award, but that gives you feedback on. It will give an opportunity to resubmit. Everybody can check on this new ESI extension policy. There is now a policy to give an automatic 1-year extension for childbirth. This does apply primarily to women. Men can still apply for ESI extension if they've had a lot of child rearing necessity that has taken them out of the research. Always important to have multiple mentors so that you've got someone to go to if there's a problem, leaders and peers in the field if possible. Going to visit other labs either at the institution or at a different institution is actually really useful, because that builds a network, but it also lets you know about where there are opportunities. And then this most important, that the mentor really must be amenable to the career development opportunities. I have definitely seen instances where there have been people who've had a K award, and then the mentor has actually taken everything that came from that K award and put it into their next R01. And that isn't the goal of this career development award. It's really career development so that the individual can go on to independent. Then if you're going to write a grant, start early, as I mentioned. The results and productivity during the K award will have an impact. If you have that K award, to go for an R01, actually go for pilot awards from centers, foundation awards as relevant, because that gives an opportunity to build the research and also to have some funding. I mentioned this, don't write the full grant before gaining input. It's pretty important to get a group together. And then it's always important to have somebody who's outside the direct area of research, because on a review panel, there's probably going to be one who really knows the field of the area of interest. So you've got to be able to write a grant that is readable by everybody. Consult the program officer on the K ahead of the R and establish the likely NIH Institute Center or study section, and then know the review policy and the study section, because that's another thing. I'd served, I guess, a lot on study sections, and there were situations where people would be on the study section, they were in that particular area of interest, and their papers weren't even cited. And that doesn't go down well. So really important to cite the experts in the field. And this will show you what study sections exist and who's on it. Although there are always also not permanent members, but people who are ad hoc and go on for a couple of times. Often you won't know that's going to happen until about a month before the study section is convened. So a few tips: read grant writing, write clearly and concisely, make sure figures and legends are readable. That was again, my study section experience, where with tiny figures, tiny font. Avoid too much information, figures help. As I mentioned, right, for experts and non-experts in the field, and be sure you cite the leading articles in the field. And then this is another one: edit and carefully proofread, because that's the other thing that can really send a grant not doing very well. And don't be over ambitious. I have to say, I always had a fourth aim when I was trying to write R01s, and then I absolutely took that fourth aim out, and that became my future. That will be what I will do if this thing pans out. So the Biosketch is sort of important. It's changed. There's a bit more information is required right now, your contributions to science, research support, and this is certainly scored as well during the review. But the other important part is, especially if you're writing a K award and you're going to talk about the career development opportunities there, you really want to combine some of the things about you outside of the Biosketch and in a career development award as well. So then a few things about the specific aims. Typically a central hypothesis, having a sub-hypothesis is pretty important. Solve a particular problem. All members of the review panel read this page and they all get to score it. So that's sort of important, that this should be one of the best. State the problem, why you can solve it, what's new. And then a summary figure helps. I will say that, at least as far as I understand it, it's going to come down that we can't put figures in specific aims anymore, but you can put a figure immediately after that specific aim, and then end with why completing the aims will be a contribution to the biomedical field or clinical practice and to career development as relevant. And then there's got to be a strong testable hypothesis. The important part is, if you have a hypothesis and aim 1 doesn't pan out, and aim 2 requires that aim 1 actually pan out, that's not going to go down well in review. So you've got to be really sure that you have multiple possibilities for aim 1 and 2. And you know, I'll give you an example. I wrote a grant on trying to look at mediators of fibrosis. And if you look at one mediator and then that mediator actually never comes up in terms of being involved in fibrosis, in Crohn's disease or whatever, and yet the next aim is I'm going to look at the mechanism by which that mediator does that, that's not going to work out. So you've got to have multiple mediators, multiple possibilities, and then I'm going to take the one that is the most correlated with this particular disease mechanism or whatever, and I'm going to look further into that. Methods are the means to perform your experiments, and the hypothesis should be testable with the duration and level of support. And then the significance is really how important this is, how it's going to really change scientific knowledge, advance things, and what's new is innovation. All of these are scored review criteria, that it can't just be something which is continuing, something that has already been published. And the approach is probably the most important part of the grant. So this is the one that correlates with the overall impact score, the methods and the analyses to test the hypothesis, attention to positive and negative controls and randomization, benchmarks for success, and then always talk about what are the potential problems, but have an alternative strategy to go after if something isn't going to work out. If it's early stages of development, say that we can manage high risk aspects by doing ABC, and then there's more attention. Rigor is now a scored criterion in most grants, so very important to do the power calculations and everything else. And then this institutional environment and commitment, they really do count. Clear documentation. So if this is the first R1, the department chair should actually be writing a letter to say this individual is really qualified to go on to this. My department is going to offer them support for A, B, C, D, E. Strong letters of support and collaboration. Again, the study section experience that I had was somebody coming in with a Drosophila grant from an institution that had some of the world's experts in Drosophila. And they never even mentioned those individuals in this R01, and it really caused the grant to tank. So definitely document available resources and cause collaborators within or outside of the institution. And then if transitioning from a mentored award, really important to have the mentor write a letter and say, this individual is ready to go to this next and is going to be able to go to independence. So then strategic career planning. Really important to plan strategically when you're approaching the end of funding. Conserve resources, go to leadership and identify and request sources of bridging funds. So if you get a grant that didn't score and you're going to be without funding a year from then not a good idea if you don't go to ask for some additional support. If you have to write grants, go ask for protected time or assistance to achieve the goals. I think I mentioned that I found myself in the office on a weekend every Sunday, and I was doing things I just shouldn't have been doing. And I went to my department chair and said, if I'm going to be able to do the things I have to do, I've got to have some administrative support. And he gave it to me. But if you don't ask, you won't get. So also ask for relief from non-essential activities and committees. This consulting with the program officer about unfunded grants is also important. You can call them and say, you know, can you give me any guidance on the things that I should do, the additional data I need to have, and then always apply to alternate sources so that you have an option beyond NIH. Then just a few things. The early stage investigator definition has changed a little bit. So it used to be 10 years from the terminal research degree or the end of residency. Because we knew that residency didn't really allow research, that has changed now to the end of postgraduate clinical training. That includes the fellowship, whichever date is later. And so for clinicians, grant to be sure that they have updated in their ERA Commons profile the end of their fellowship, not the end of residency. And then, as mentioned, certainly request an extension of early stage investigator status if there are valid reasons. And you can certainly go to the NIH website and they'll talk about the different reasons for that. This is just an update on the NIH Loan Repayment Program. I was actually part of a working group that actually worked on how do we improve the loan repayment program. We currently have these areas: clinical, pediatric, health disparities, contraception, and infertility. Basic research is only in the pediatric and the contraception and infertility. The good news is that the maximum amount that people can apply for the loan repayment program is now 50,000. It used to be 35,000. It's up to 25% of the eligible debt. There's still this at least 50% research for 2 years. You have to be doing that, but the K awards actually really allow that, so that's okay to do. And the success rates are pretty good for these loan repayment programs. I will say that there are some updates that are likely to be coming in the next couple of years, where one of the things that we're trying to do is to try and identify some gap areas that we can actually extend the eligibility beyond these particular areas. That's not completed yet, but stay tuned and we'll let people know. Hopefully most of you know about the clinical trials policy now. There are FOAs that either will specify that it has to be a clinical trial, somebody leading a clinical trial, or it can be not clinical trials, but clinical trials research experience. So the R01s are like this, the K awards permit independent clinical trials, or it's when it says clinical trial not allowed, that doesn't mean people can't do training in that. But important that the training grants and the fellowship awards only permit clinical trials research experience. You can't lead a clinical trial. And in part, that's because these awards don't have the research funding for somebody to be able to cover a clinical trial. But you can still, somebody can still participate in all aspects of a clinical trial to get the training experience. And then this is the other one. This is this Orchid ID requirement, open researcher and contributor identifiers. This is with the goal that we want to be able to track publications and funding sort of beyond NIH. This will occur as part of the appointment process for trainees and those that are appointed to these institutional K awards. And then for individual fellowship and K awards, this is at the time of the application. So we will require Orchid IDs. Apparently it's a very easy process, so don't stress at having to do this, but it's the hope that we can actually follow people's careers better than just by NIH funding. And so with that, I'll sort of end. I think it's really important to think about science rewarding, constant, exciting discoveries. Certainly for me, the mentees that I have mentored, they form a family of former trainees. I interact with them all the time. I'm there for them to help when they're going on to their next career stage. And then this is always one that doesn't go down well when I say it, but I think people stress too much when they're writing a grant. You shouldn't be focusing on the stress. You should be focusing on, this is a really important question. I'm one of these people who really wants to answer it. Don't feel too stressed out about the fact that even though funding is competitive, what you really should be doing of that scientific question and what you're able to do with that. And then with that, I'll stop and take questions, and I'm sorry if I went too long.